back to the Deeper Dive podcast, produced locally in the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., here at Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church in La Plata, Maryland. My name is Bill Winnell, joined this afternoon by Monsignor Charles Pope. Good afternoon, Monsignor.
Good afternoon.
And Father Larry Swing. How are you, Father?
Hey, good afternoon.
Today we're going to continue our series on the Ten Commandments. And we are up to number 5 now. Father Larry.
Okay. So I'm really glad we're doing this series on the Ten Commandments. I talked to someone today who told me that he was at one of these men's groups and they were talking about the Ten Commandments, and I guess none of the guys were able to go through the 10, and the leader said, "How are we going to keep the Ten Commandments? We don't know them." So I think it's good to be reminded of these things if we know them, or told them if we don't know them. So today we enter into number 5, which thou shalt not kill. And I think the word in the original language is more explicitly "thou shalt not murder," but I will leave that to the translation expertise of Monsignor Pope. And then we're going to go into the different ways of which thou shalt not kill. A lot of people, I think, erroneously think they don't commit sins against this commandment, but when you dig deep, most of us probably do on a regular basis. So let's jump into it.
Sure. Yeah, so obviously, I think you're right. The best translation, really more accurately, would be to murder, because there are some forms of, in fact, it talks about it in the Catechism, some legitimate forms of self-defense that it actually doesn't break the commandment, but it actually is a fulfillment of. We can talk about that maybe more in a minute. But the other aspect of it, Father, I think, is that we have, like, for example, the question of war. So-called just war. So these are kind of an examples where sometimes killing to save the lives of others or our very own life is sometimes sadly foisted upon us. But again, so that's why I think murder here would be better. But tradition being what it is, you shall not kill is just kind of come down to us. Yeah.
All right, so where do we start? I believe from the Catechism, it starts from the womb to the tomb almost. And but I think it starts off with self-defense, and it makes that explicit distinction between self-defense and murdering someone. So why don't we start there, Monsignor? What would be a legitimate kill versus a murder?
All right. Legitimate self-defense. This is from, I'm going to go from, say, Catechism 2263. It says, that's the paragraph number. It says, the legitimate defense of persons and societies is not an exception to the prohibition of the murder of the innocent that constitutes the intentional killing. This is because love, this is interesting what they say. This is because love towards oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Therefore, it is legitimate to insist on a respect for one's own right to life. Someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he is forced to deal with his aggressor by a lethal blow. So again, it says the legitimate self-defense is not seen as an exception to the 5th commandment, but rather a fulfillment of it. And this is where it goes on to say something else in 2265. Legitimate defense cannot only be a right, but it can even be a grave duty for someone responsible for the lives of others, the common good or the family or the state. And that's why we spend a lot of time trying to secure our presidents and other leaders of state. And, you and I are more expendable, Father, I must say, because we don't have families depending on us. So we would have less of a need for that. But it would make sense that, say, a father of children has to care for not just himself, but his own family. And so again, all of these are ways of saying that, yeah, you're right. It starts out with trying to sort out what we don't mean by the commandment. We don't mean it's never right to kill anyone or anything, but rather, the unlawful killing or the taking of a life, murder, in other words, of someone is excluded, but not necessarily all killing.
Okay. So moving forward, I think the first thing in the Catechism, it speaks about the sin of abortion. And I was reading in the Wall Street Journal several days ago that there are more, even though federally the abortion has been overturned, there's more abortions today than there were in the last couple years because of chemical abortions.
Hmm.
So it's still a lot of people are not heeding this commandment. Why do you think our culture is so adamant about defending the right to have an abortion? Why do people not get it that, essentially a life is a life? And
Yeah.
um
I think that you're right that it's sad now. This sort of we call them by different terms or names, but this drug, the sort of a Plan B drug, or sometimes these just take the pill and induce a kind of a chemical abortion. It's first of all, I think it's that's the majority of abortions now. The
yeah.
surgical abortion is less common, but unfortunately these chemical. But I have a feeling, Father, and I hope that this will also curtail in that. I think it's a very dangerous thing. It induces heavy bleeding on the part of the woman, and there's a lot of dangerous aspects. And when the lawsuits start rolling in, I think there's going to
Mhm.
be more restrictions of this so-called
Right.
abortion pill. But anyway, I mean, that tends to be what happens, because again, it's a very dangerous drug. It just is. And
Mm.
it's not. Remember how they used to say safe, legal, and rare?
Yeah.
They didn't mean any of that stuff, really. They didn't. But what I could say is that you asked a sociological question. I'm sad to say, Father, I think that most people don't quote get it because I think if something doesn't have a face, we don't love it. I hate to put it
Mm.
that way, but especially at the earlier stages of pregnancy, most people think of an embryo as kind of just like more like a tadpole. I mean,
Right.
it's sad. I mean, it's terrible. But at the end of the day, um, people do a lot of emotional reasoning, not proper reasoning, and so they just don't want to be stuck or have women have no options and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, those would be my inelegant answers to a very tragic issue in our culture, and
Yeah.
it really comes down to the fact that we don't love children anymore. I mean, as a culture.
Yeah. It's interesting in the catechism too, Monsignor, is that it says since the first century of the church that
Hmm.
we've affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. And it quotes the Didache in the catechism. It says,
Yeah.
you shall not kill the embryo by abortion and shall
Hmm.
not to cause the newborn to perish. So even in the first century, there's
Hmm.
this recognition of the embryo, even though it's not fully formed as being a human life that
Sure.
was given the right to life.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. And you remember when Nancy Pelosi some years ago said that this teaching about abortion really only came up in the church starting in the 1950s. And you say, what? I mean, the
I
document you're quoting from there, the Didache,
I
that, that,
remember that.
that was written in like 90 AD, and it's very clear you shall not kill the child in the womb by abortion.
Yeah.
And you're not doing that. That's just not to be done. So it's a pretty old teaching.
I remember that weekend Cardinal World had us preach about the true teaching of that,
Hmm.
and we had to basically set people straight that no, we believe that life. Remember that we had begins at
Yeah.
conception. We had to do a
Yeah.
whole homily on it. Yeah.
Yeah, the
So
the bishops really woke up with that one when they, they said, "Wait a minute, you're taking our job away. We're the ones who say what's been taught." But yeah, anyway, so it was it's an ancient teaching, and of course, why didn't Jesus mention it? Some people say, or Paul or whatever. And of course, because they lived in a culture that women wanted children, they wanted bigger families. Getting married and having children was your social security. I hate to put it that way, but I don't want to overly romanticize how virtuous people were in the old days. But basically, you weren't expecting some check from the government. You raised your kids, changed their diapers, mashed their food, so that when you got old, they would change your diapers and mash your food. And that's kind of how life worked until the 1930s, when all this notion of a government check and the government replacing families as the main way that we take care of each other. The real social teaching of the church should focus on families and keeping families strong, not a lot of government interventions. But anyway, I'm digressing.
right.
But
Uh,
by the way, can I say one more thing though about abortion?
yeah,
That
please.
we often say, and we need to because we're speaking in a scientific way, that life begins at conception, and in a scientific way it does. But really, it begins long before. The Lord says in what's it, Jeremiah 1:5 or 6, he says, "Before I ever formed you in the womb, I knew you." So in other words, there's no such thing as an unwanted child or a surprise pregnancy or a what have you in God's eyes. God has always known us before we were formed in our mother's womb. And he did what was necessary to put everything in place just so we could be just as we are. He knit us together in our mother's womb, Psalm 139. So all of those are things that I know that many of our listeners are well rehearsed on, but in a way, when we say human life is sacred, we mean that it has God for its origin, not just a biological process. And in speaking in a scientific age to a scientific kind of world, we do need to say, well, life begins at conception. But I would argue for all of us, don't you ever think that you were a surprise to God. You know.
Mm, yeah. And then it moves on to it goes all the way from that to euthanasia.
Mm,
So those whose lives are diminished or weakened deserve special respect. Sick or handicapped persons should be helped to lead lives as normal as possible. But the idea of when the act or omission, which of itself by intention causes death in order to eliminate suffering, constitutes a murder gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person and to the respect
yeah.
due to the living God. So to
Hmm.
deliberately, it's interesting too here that I've met two. I know two people that have attempted to go to Europe because in Europe you can go to these certain places
Yeah.
and you can just
Check
pay
into a death clinic. Yeah.
death clinic, yeah, where they euthanize you with a needle or something like or a pill,
Hmm.
and it's perfectly legitimate and and then the idea is I'll live happily ever after, and
Hmm.
uh, probably not.
Hmm.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
do you
Do
have?
not commit a mortal sin going out the door. That's never a good plan.
Right. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on euthanasia? You think this is a
Hmm.
big threat in the United States of America, or are people aware of this sort of activity? Or
Well, I'll quote a couple things from the Catechism, and then yeah, maybe comment on the public situation. But it says here from the Catechism 2277, whatever its motives and means, direct euthanasia constitutes or consists in putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, or dying persons. It is morally unacceptable. So I have good motives and I'm trying to alleviate suffering. I know, but you got to look at the nature of the act. You are killing a human being because they are dying or handicapped or sick. Um, nope, can't do that. And then it goes on to say here, any act or omission which of itself or by its intentions causes death in order to eliminate suffering constitutes a murder, gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person and the respect due to the living God, his creator. So, in other words, our life is in God's hands.
right.
And you are not your own. You've been purchased at a price. Glorify God in your body. And now, again, we can all puzzle over why God allows suffering, and that's a whole nother podcast. But I mean, at the end of the day, suffering does come to us, and it can be very profitable for us by God's grace. I think that the last 6 months of my father's life were probably the most important 6 months of his life. He was dying and he was suffering a lot, and yet he was also, bearing the hatchet and having those important conversations that fathers should have with their children, and
Mm.
all of those things. And I think, so we have to also, how it is when we sing songs in our church like "Lift High the Cross," but you know what? We don't mean it. Now, what I mean by that is, anytime that cross wants to come in for a landing, we want to run as fast and as far as we can from it. So, are you saying that a person who's actively dying should not be allowed to just end their life? Yeah, that's what we're saying. You see, but we're so frightened of the cross. We're so frightened. We don't lift high the cross. We're actually quite embarrassed by it. I'm talking collectively here, of course. I'm going to suggest that maybe most of our listeners are above average there, Father. But at the end of
Mm.
the day, in the American scene, everything is about kind of, hedonism kind of gets a bad name. Hedonism means hedone is the Greek word for pleasure, that life is all about pleasure and maximizing pleasure. And when there isn't pleasure, well, end it.
Mm,
And so this is a concept of hedonism and so on. But again, I want to say that notice how it says the dignity of the human person. It's referring to not just the dignity of their life, but also our dignity as being rational creatures who can understand that our sufferings, for reasons we don't always fully understand, but our sufferings have place in our life, and they help us to be, better human beings and to repent of sins, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can't give a whole theology of suffering, but we are just terrible, terrible, terrible. In our world today, in the modern age, suffering has no meaning at all. It's just awful. Whereas in the Christian tradition, suffering is filled with meaning and it's
right.
part of our lot, and how we participate in the cross of Christ, et cetera. I don't. So I think, Father, that's kind of my sense that it's a misguided sense of compassion.
Well, I think all the topics, almost except for self-defense,
Hmm.
probably fall into that category of running away from the cross.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't want a baby to change my life.
Yeah. Are you
You
saying that
know,
she has to have that baby? Yeah, that's what we're saying. We need to
right?
help her, but by God, yeah, that's what we're saying.
Or even yeah, and it's probably. I mean, sometimes it's hard watching someone go through a ton of suffering,
Yeah.
but I think it's the call for the Christian. Well, I think it's a call for ourselves and our own sufferings to see
Hmm.
that this is profitable. But when we see in other people, to realize that
Yeah.
same thing and do what we can to alleviate the suffering as much as possible to make life as comfortable as possible.
Hmm.
That is possible, though,
No,
and then leave the rest up to God.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah,
and
my
I,
life, Lord, is in your hands. It's not mine to take or give.
yeah,
I I'm I'm yours. You know.
yeah. And then the next one, I mean, these are all,
Yeah.
it's kind of a dark commandment, but suicide.
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't know how many funerals you've done through deaths of suicides,
Yeah.
Monsignor, but they're tough,
Yeah.
and
They are. Right.
it just leaves a real pit in your stomach when you find out someone's taken their life. And
Yeah.
I've known several people that have done so, and it just leaves a real um,
Hmm.
empty space,
Hmm.
that you just and a lot of confusion
Yeah.
for those that remain, blaming
Yep.
themselves for what happened and so
Yep.
forth.
Yep.
And so, but once again, I think suicide is one of those things where people find themselves losing hope or in some kind of suffering, and therefore, to alleviate the suffering, I'm just going to end my life,
Yeah.
or I don't
Right.
want to take responsibility for what happened or
Right.
whatever. Yeah. What do you have any comments on this particular one?
Yeah. I think we need to distinguish some things about suicide. There are the types of suicides where a person is, we think okay and in good health, but they take their life. Maybe they're depressed or discouraged. It could be that there's a form of mental illness that alleviates some of their full guilt for this. But objectively speaking, you have no right to take your own life. Your life belongs to God. So that's the moral principle involved. But as I say, some people go into great despair and God will have to sort that out, but we have to be very, very careful not to lionize people who have committed suicide. And I'm afraid this sometimes happens in some of these teenage suicides, where the whole school turns out and they're all talking about Johnny and that kind of stuff. And I think personally, pastorally, we should handle death by suicide, especially when it involves younger people, by having very private funerals. And um, yeah, but I would also say, but just for the record, my sister technically died by suicide. I mean, she was paranoid schizophrenic, and she would hear voices, and so among other things that she would do sometimes was set fires. And she, at age 30, set a fire that she died in.
Mm,
And but my sister was mentally ill, and I would attribute it that to her death to that. The ones I'm worried about most, Father, are those who, like I say, do the physician assisted suicide stuff. I had a parishioner many years ago say he was in contact with the Hemlock Society, which was and they were going to be sending him the pills to take so he can kill himself. And I said, "Don't you dare do that. You will go to hell. You will go to hell for that. I have no doubt you'll go to hell for it." Well,
mm.
I don't feel like living anymore. And I'm like, I understand that, but you will go to hell. Do not do that. It's
Right.
a terrible thing to commit a mortal sin going out the door
Right.
because you can't repent of it. And so these are things that I think we have got to be more, clear with people in our culture about. And I think the church is reasonably clear about it. But at the end of the day, sometimes at a pastoral level, priests like you and I have to just say, ain't happening.
Yeah.
And, so, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it-
how do you
that's the
deal
worst kind of suicide. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
how do you deal with like parents, or it's like one of these unexpected things and you're trying to console them
Yeah.
after the suicide? I mean, I always go to 2283. But I mean, I think everyone knows it's a serious sin.
Hmm.
That's not
Yeah.
negotiable.
Yeah. Right.
However, or it's grave matter, but we should not despair of the eternal salvation of
Yeah.
persons who have taken their own lives by ways known to him alone. God can provide the
Hmm.
opportunity for solitary repentance. The church prays for persons who have taken their own lives, and I think the biggest fear I think that parents have is that their child's in 100% in hell,
Oh,
if
yeah.
the, you
Yeah.
know, and but at the same time, but I think you're absolutely right. I think when it comes to, because there's also, I've noticed with these suicide things, a monkey see, monkey do.
Yeah.
People see a friend do it, then they do
Yeah.
it. And I think in one high school, there was like 3 suicides in 3 months, you
Yeah. And
know?
part of it is because they lionize these kids that do it. And wow. And as I say, I want to make it clear what I said earlier too, Father. I think that I would say most cases of suicide, I would still have great hope that they can be with God, and that they may need time in purgatory, but at the end of the day, I think many of them act out of great despair and mental health issues that are just besetting them. And but as I say, the one exception I would make to that is physician assisted suicide, because it's
Right,
cold,
right,
it's calculating, you include other people in it, it's just the most awful, awful thing.
right. No, 100%. I believe that too, and that's, I mean, I think you said what you said was spot on, because you're looking at someone making a very direct decision, a
Hmm.
very calculated decision,
Right.
and so, um, so then it goes into, scandal. We don't, well,
Well, yeah, there is an extended sense there that the scandal can kill the soul by enticing people into serious sin. So there's a kind of a murder of the soul that goes on in giving scandal. Mm.
right. Um, Yeah, Jesus says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it will be better for him to have a great millstone fashioned around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea."
Yeah.
Scandal is grave when given by those who by nature or office are obliged to teach and educate others. I think that's why the scandal in the priesthood was so
Mm.
severe.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be, speaking or living the lives of chastity and celibacy, and meanwhile, there's things going on, and
Mhm. Yeah.
but yeah, I think this is. I don't think people really take this to heart, that people look up to authorities. I think parents, priests, teachers,
Hmm.
coaches realize that athletes, what they
Yep.
do is
Yeah.
is going to affect many people because people look up to certain
Mhm.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess
And we,
it's
we we have to, respect that the soul has a life too that can be, and I'm putting in this in quotes now, but killed in when one goes into mortal sin, and seduction and other forms of scandal and so on. Are scandal is, it's interesting. At first, scandal has the effect of shocking people, but the worst effect of scandal ultimately is that people are no longer shocked.
right.
When I was a kid, I mean, if someone was living together before marriage, we called that shacking up. It was it was shocking. Or getting divorced was shocking. And now it's like, well, yeah, whatever, man.
Right. No one blushes anymore.
No, that's a terrible thing. And so, yeah, it's a form of killing, the
Do,
life of the soul.
Do you remember in I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, and Elvis Presley is like dancing, and his mother is just like she almost passes out because he's gyrating in such a way. I
Yeah,
mean,
Elvis Presley, right?
compared to the dancing we see today,
Oh,
we're not even we're not even close to that. That
right.
was modest compared to what's happening today on
Indeed.
the TV screen. Um, all right, next one that's a favorite is respect for health. Wow.
Mm,
Um, so it says the virtue of temperance disposes us to avoid every kind of excess, the abuse of
mm,
food, alcohol, tobacco, or medicine. Those incur grave health who, by drunkenness or love of speed, endanger their own lives,
yeah.
others' safety on the road, at sea, or in the air. Yeah, it's funny how they put in the air. You hope your pilot's not drinking, but but I guess it has happened.
Yeah, sadly. Yeah, there's that whole movie on that one. Yeah. Denzel.
What about smoking marijuana,
Yeah.
Monsignor Pope?
Oh, well, I will tell you this. I have noticed that those who have ever smoked much marijuana, I would say, I notice an effect that's kind of permanent in them where they seem to lose a lot of motivation.
Mm.
I remember when I was in high school, you could almost tell right away when a kid started smoking dope. Because he just, hey man, I ain't got to go to the man's class, man. I don't want to go party, man. It was just these were good kids who were talented, and some of were athletes, and they started smoking dope, and all their motivation went away. And it seemed to be a semi-permanent thing that when you're drunk, it's a temporary condition, and you kind of recover. And you may have done harm, but my point is that your brain isn't usually permanently affected. Whereas I don't think that's true with marijuana. I see somewhat permanent effects with this kind of like laid back, token on a number, kind of sort of an attitude to life. And it takes all your zeal away. So I think that the more we learn about marijuana as it's more widely used, I think we're going to have to write about it more about in terms of the morality of it.
Mm.
I think basically what I'm saying is I think it causes brain damage. And by the way, a lot of studies are beginning to show that, especially in the frontal lobe, that it causes some permanent brain damage. Basically, the motivational things go away, just what you observed.
So here's
But
my Giesen moment of the week.
mhm.
I went in for my colonoscopy consult the other day, and the lady's
Oh,
she's going down the list of things I can't do before the thing.
yeah, very.
You on blood thinners, all the normal stuff. And the
Yeah.
last thing is she goes, and you can't smoke weed 24 hours beforehand. And I'm like, I was like, waiting for kind of to see if I was paying attention. It was a joke she thought. No, it wasn't. It was literally on the sheet now. She's
Yeah,
going down. And I
right.
keep forgetting how it's legal most everywhere around here now.
Yeah.
But I was like, huh,
Bill, no smoking dope, man,
I
before your
know. But
colonoscopy.
she didn't say anything about gummies though, so I might be okay. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, well, yeah, when they put you under, you don't want to have anything that
Yeah,
would make anesthesia go wild on you.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's true.
Well, anyway, all I can say is that I think what I'm saying is right now, I would say largely an opinion. But I think that given my own, I never smoke. I never even tried a cigarette. I've never used it, but I've seen what's happened to people who do, and they just kind of get lost.
Mm. Yeah. Um, we're not supposed to kidnap and hostage taking. Let's skip that. Um,
Oh, by the way, I want to just say though, going back to health, I hope everyone can see by my svelte figure that I don't have any troubles with eating too much, and you know, it's all about my metabolism, man. So again, I think what the main point to remember is that our bodies are not our own. We should glorify God in our body. That doesn't mean we have to be walking around like an Adonis. We have to balance things in life, but at the end of the day, we tend to get heavier and things as we get older. But at the end of the day, I think we have to take seriously our own health and encourage good health in other people. And so yeah, I like that. And then of course, yeah, you're going into other areas now, Father. You just mentioned.
so, what
Yeah.
about respect for the dead? This is kind of
Mhm.
a, we're talking about someone who's already dead,
Yeah.
and so it says the dying should be given attention and care to help them live the last moments in dignity and peace.
Hmm.
Uh, they will be helped by the prayer of the relatives and also receive the sacraments at the proper time.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
also, it brings up the whole. This is a favorite topic of you, the topic of cremation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the church permits cremation, provided that it does not demonstrate a denial of faith in the resurrection of the body.
Mm.
I'm sure we've all been experienced where you've gone to a house and, there's a picture of so and so, and there's a vase, and like, oh,
Right.
what's in there? And oh, that's Frank. Oh, what's Frank doing on the top of your piano? You
Yeah.
know,
Give Frank a decent burial, please.
right. And maybe we could help listeners understand, why is it important to have a proper burial
You
if
know.
it's just your body?
Yeah, and again, there have been many cultures where cremation has been used for a long, long time. But but what happens is that people talk about the remains as ashes. They're not ashes. They are the human remains of what remains of the body. Okay, and therefore this is not to be thrown out in the woods or out of planes or into the sea, scattered. These kinds of things. Any more than you would amputate arms and legs. I'm going to take the arm home. You go ahead and take the torso. I mean, dividing up a human. Sometimes people even divide the things. So the idea is that even if cremation is allowed, respect for the body demands that whatever the remains, the cremains, they're usually called, are not ashes. They are to be gathered and kept together and given a proper entombment, shall we say, whether in a niche somewhere at a cemetery or at a in the ground and so on. Burial at sea is possible, but you don't throw the ashes or scatter them. They have to be contained. And so, anyway, all of these are just ways of saying that part of our respect for the body is even when there's not a lot of it left, we should still respect it as if that's just that's the body. It is the body to what remains, and it should be treated that way with respect. So, yeah, I would also say, unfortunately, in the church, we're not very. We've not shown ourselves very well able to adjust to this crazy culture because, we permitted cremation, but we didn't really catechize people. And so they don't say, well, what's so wrong with him, man? Come on. He wanted to be thrown into the woods. Yeah, that way he can be trampled over by animals and whatever. I don't know. But the point is, people kind of are a little bit sometimes not that understanding of why we have this concern for how the cremains are treated. And but part of it is that again, there needs to be a reverence for the body, which we lack in this sort of Gnostic culture we're in. My body doesn't matter. I'm really a female, even though my body's male. It all ties together. This lack of understanding that the soul and the body have that hylomorphic kind of union, and that they have to be treated with equal respect and dignity. And so it comes from a broader problem, I think, in the culture.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's also maybe a misunderstanding or an ignorance of the fact that the bodies that we have will indeed resurrect on the last day. Obviously,
Mhm. Yeah.
a more improved version of it, a
Mhm. Yeah.
resurrected version, but
Hopefully.
that hopefully, yeah,
By the way, Father, just to say, and I don't want to. I've been under the authority of at least four archbishops. I could be five. I have to do them, but anyway, I've talked to all of them at some point about how we've got to get some kind of a policy in place about cremation, and but none of them want to do anything about it. And you and I are on the front lines, and so we have to deal with the fact. Yeah, you go to somebody's house, and there's Uncle Joe on the fireplace mantle, or in a closet, or you're like, well, what's the deal here? And likewise, for example, I have a lot of people who choose cremation now, and the question is, should I even celebrate a funeral until a burial is scheduled? Well, the diocese says no. I have to celebrate the funeral in a timely manner. Okay, but what are we gonna do about the cremation? I don't know. Well, maybe we should like get a group together and talk about this and sort of work together. Maybe with the Catholic cemeteries could have a what is it? When you turn in your firearms? What is that? Called?
Yeah.
No
right.
questions asked. Just bring your loved ones, and we're going to have a big pit, and we're going to get them all buried and have a marker.
Well, not to get mired down in this, but since we're talking about it, I mean, we too have seen I would say, an exponentially significant increase
Yeah.
in people to be cremated.
Hmm.
Is there any? Does the church have anything to say? I mean, would the preference be that the
Hmm.
body is present at the funeral and the cremation's done afterwards?
Yes.
In the rite of the funeral, in the funeral rite book, it does state
Hmm.
that the preferred option is that the body is at the funeral mass and the cremation happens afterwards.
Hmm.
Very few people do that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Guess why? Money. Money.
yeah, it's money
All about
because
money.
because
That's
you have,
all about money. That's not fair, but
well, I to be fair, I think it is about money.
yeah.
I think it's, uh, where there's a will, there's a dead person, and I think
Right.
that,
Where there's a
uh,
will, there's a relative.
there's a relative, and I just think that, yeah, I think I think the best thing you can do is, to recently I had a woman come to me who, and she wants to bury her father, and it's difficult because no one will help pay for it. And I was trying to
Hmm.
find ways to do this. It's very expensive to
Yeah.
do it, and it's not and I get it. It's not a
Hmm.
cheap endeavor to do a proper burial. I mean, it
No.
could cost thousands of dollars, but
Yeah.
she was dead against cremation. And I was like, wow. I was like very edified by
Yeah.
the notion of no, my father will get a proper
Hmm.
burial, you know?
Well, I've had many families over I would say maybe at least a dozen over my years of priesthood who couldn't afford. And Catholic cemeteries are always very kind about that, and all they need is a letter from the pastor, and they'll generally cover the burial. Um, Now, I don't want to advertise, I mean, but the priest is asked to write a letter that I would say is demonstrably true that they really don't have the financial wherewithal. So I would, think that's important. And again, we've gotten very blasé about how we treat the dead. People very seldom go to cemeteries anymore, except for the burial. But seldom do we go back on and visit the graves of our beloved relatives. So there's a lot of stuff that's culturally just kind of gone offline about death and dying. It used to be that people would die in home, and now they die in nursing homes, and we send them away to die. And so there's just so many factors. We could go on forever. I know we have to move on, but I think that I think a lot of us should just remember, who are older, can remember times when we weren't quite this businesslike about death and burial. It was something that to be honored, the body and likewise the place of burial. All these things were very important, and they're not so much in it now.
Right. So I think maybe one part of the fifth commandment that people don't realize the severity of what they're doing is not so much if they kill someone, but they want to kill someone.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
we're talking about anger.
yeah.
And we're
Anger.
talking about when it escalates to the point of hatred. And if
No.
it escalates to the point of hatred, it's gotten to the point of being what we would call grave matter. And if done willingly, would could be a mortal sin. So
Yeah.
how do you, I mean, how do you explain that to someone that,
Hmm.
you got to keep your anger in check and you
Yeah.
can't just desire to kill someone in your heart?
Sure. I mean, and I think that's what Jesus, of course, is getting at in the Sermon on the Mount in the fifth chapter, where he says, you've heard you shall not murder. I say to you, anyone who grows angry with his brother. Now, Jesus was angry actually quite a lot, but
Mm.
it's the type of anger that he's talking about is vengeful, or like you said, hateful anger. And how do you know that, Father? Well, because he gives an example. He says, calling your brother Raka. I mean, that's it's like the N word. It's just a very hurtful, hateful word, and you're basically saying, stop taking up oxygen. If I could kill you myself, I would. You might as well be dead for all I care. And that's where we begin to find, people don't just get up out of their bed one morning and go murder somebody. There's a long stewing anger or something's going on there. And rare indeed are just these, sudden out of the blue sort of shootings and killings. Most of it has a long history of hatred. And so again, we have to realize that we're like cauldrons and we can boil over if we don't, like you say, moderate it and get some help for our anger.
Mm. It's interesting, and I don't. Um, when you look at that particular gospel that you're quoting, there's two Greek words I believe that are used. One is thumos, and the other one is I don't know if I pronounce this correctly, orgathosai. where
Orgasai, yeah.
Orgasai, right? One is like you slam your fist, you're like, and then you're okay. And the other one is this burning, resentful anger that just
Yeah.
you keep feeding. And
Hmm.
that's the word that Jesus uses,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
actually is very, very dangerous
Sure.
because it's a
And you know,
bomb.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just putting more gunpowder on
Yeah.
near the
Yeah.
flame.
Exactly. And I would also say that there is such a thing as just anger. But yeah, like I say, in Greek there are some different words to distinguish that we don't usually have in English. So not all anger is sin, but it tends to produce anger that isn't properly dealt with, does tend to boil over after a while. And usually what we do is we start robbing the other person of their dignity. And then eventually some people do get around to actually doing the killing.
Mm.
Yeah. Same thing with nations. Remember some years ago when Tito, he was the big 900-pound gorilla that sat over this country we called in those days Yugoslavia, and he was taken out. And all of a sudden, then these Serbs and Croats and all that, man, they started killing each other in the tens of thousands. And all that simmering anger. And I can guarantee you a Serbian baby is not born into this world, hating a Croat or a Croatian baby. Somebody teaches that to them.
Right.
You need to hate them because of something that happened hundreds of years ago.
Mm.
You see, and so this is another aspect of it that sometimes we hand on a lot of social anger, resentments, and all that kind of stuff. And
Mm.
you know, those no kid is born into this world hating. No white kid is born into hating a black kid or vice versa. And these things are taught to them.
Yeah. And we see this, people say, I hate, and especially with political figures, or I hate
Yeah.
whatever. And it's like, whoa, whoa,
Hmm.
whoa, whoa. Let's say I
Let's curb the
disagree.
word. Yeah.
Yeah, hate's a very dangerous word. It's a Catholic.
Hmm.
Um, and you did mention this, and we're getting kind of to close to the end here, is avoiding war. And
Yeah.
I guess the distinction between a legitimate defense by a military force versus an unjust war. And
Hmm.
they have the just war theory is kind of stated a little bit in the Catechism by St. Thomas. Um,
Hmm.
or and do you
Yeah.
think it would be good to kind of go through
Yeah,
how
it
do
was
we?
actually Augustine who developed the just war tradition, and
Mhm.
Thomas, of course, carried. Yeah, some years ago, our previous pope trashed the just war teaching or the just war tradition, and said it was no good, and there's no such thing as a just war, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I remember writing an article. I said, "Holy Father, it's all we've got," because the purpose of the just war teaching is not to justify war, but to limit it. And so, if you go to war, there are principles that have to be followed. And again, so there's recourse to military action or use of lethal force. It has to be a last recourse. It has to have a reasonable hope of success. And it's about a grave matter. It's not just over some minor thing. And once you're in war, you have to conduct yourself. You can't kill non-combatants. You have to distinguish, and you have to limit your means to attain the end. And so again, it's a way for us to reason, even if we have to go to such something so ugly and terrible as war. I think if World War II was the so-called just war. I think we had every right to go to war. We had a need to go to war, maybe even a duty. So much of Europe was being swallowed up by Hitler's machine. But once we got into the war, we behaved very unjustly, so to speak. We carpet bombed, we firebombed. I don't know if not everybody knows what, like, for example, carpet bombing means. You just blow the hell out of a city. Literally, I'm sorry, I'm not sorry, figuratively, but I don't mean to cuss. But you just whole sections you just take out. Civilians, anyone, children, they're all gone. That's indiscriminate killing. Or
Right.
again, firebombing is a terrible thing, and it explodes above the ground, and like napalm, and all this fire goes out in all directions, and the whole city is burned. We
Mm.
firebombed Tokyo before we hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then of course, yeah, the atom bombs. And now look, I know it's easy to look back in the rearview mirror and say we should have behaved better. I'm not here to just judge everybody, even including Truman, who went ahead with the bombing of the nuclear bomb. But I do think we have a lot of accounting to do for even the so-called good war that we call the Second World War. And the point I was trying to make, though, in all of this, and to the Holy Father, when I wrote my column, of course he didn't read it, I'm sure, but was that it's all we've got, and to just throw it away as like a filthy rag was a bad idea. I will say there's one fruit I would say of the just war tradition that we are very careful today, and I am putting that in kind of air quotes here again, but we really do try to distinguish combatants from non-combatants. There, a lot of this precision bombing and all that comes from the theory or the tradition of just war. That we don't just wipe out whole cities. We try to target what really needs to be targeted and not cause a lot of collateral damage, and that comes from the just war teaching. Anyway, I'm getting lectury here. Sorry.
No, no, no. I enjoy it. And yeah, but it goes down to the point that we as a church we're always trying to avoid war, and I think
Hmm.
as people we want to avoid war, but sometimes you have to have principles set into effect to
Hmm.
go forth when it's the only recourse to bring about peace.
Right. Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it's
Sadly, that's sometimes the case.
yeah.
There's an old saying in Latin, "Si vis pacem para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah. What about the
Like,
death
mhm.
penalty? We didn't talk about the
Oh
death
boy.
penalty. Sorry.
Oh yeah. No. I
We got 9 minutes. You want to just nail the death penalty?
Sure. Sure. I think that
Well,
one. Yeah.
here's
Yeah.
one
Go
thing.
ahead. Yeah.
A lot of times, when you get into, I'd say, arguments or discussions about this matter, people say, well, they'll equate the death penalty with something like abortion, and
Oh yeah. Yeah. I do.
they'll say, well, I'm against the death penalty, but I think the woman has a right to choose. And you're like, whoa, 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 whoa,
Yeah.
whoa,
Or
whoa,
vice versa.
or vice, yeah, yeah. So
Mhm.
how do you look at the death penalty as a
Mhm.
Catholic? Just
Mhm.
with a very
No.
rational approach.
Well, I think that the death penalty would have to be a form of legitimate killing, which would require a lot of things, right? That this person is a real danger,
Right.
and the only real way to end the danger is to put them to death. Now, I'm personally against the use of the death penalty. I'm not against it philosophically, but I think in our culture today we could find we can have non-lethal means to detain criminals and so on. I'll get to that more in a moment, but the point is that I think in the culture of death. Now, what do I mean by the culture of death? I'm talking the way John Paul and Benedict used it. In the culture of death, the death or non-existence of human beings is considered to be a solution to problems. So you don't want to shout, abort it. You don't want to suffer at the end of life, kill them. Kill the patient. You got a criminal. Well, kill him. And I think that so I do think there's a certain uh, a continuum of life that I want to say we should always avoid to as much as possible the killing of other human beings, only in really necessary times. And so the question is, how necessary is the death penalty? I personally would conclude not that necessary, and therefore we should not have recourse to it. But I don't like people who like are some people attribute it as being intrinsically evil or wrong. I think there was a lot of debate over Pope Francis, who changed the catechism to say that the death penalty today is inadmissible, as if to say it's intrinsically evil. I don't know if that's what he meant to say, but I don't think we can call it intrinsically evil, because if that's the case, St. Paul and the Holy Spirit never got the memo, because St. Paul says, look, man, if you misbehave, the state, the emperor, whoever, will wield the sword.
Mm.
And in so doing, act as a minister of justice. So behave yourself. So, in other words, you can't call the death penalty intrinsically evil like we would abortion. The death penalty should, I would say, have very limited use in our culture, but it isn't intrinsically evil. There are also and then some people argue, and I'm not saying they're just shooting in the breeze. I think a lot of people argue, well, look, we don't have the will to keep dangerous criminals locked up. You were with me out there at St. Thomas More, Father Larry, when we were together, and that was a dangerous neighborhood, and most of those people had no business being out of jail. They'd been robbing and murdering and rape and all kinds of stuff, and they're out walking the streets.
Mm.
And you're like, well, so in other words, I think if we're going to say we don't need to use the death penalty, that we need to be much more serious than we currently are about keeping very dangerous criminals off, from walking our streets. And we don't seem to have that will. So I think that I accept that. I think you're right. But we need to, I think, fix that. In other words, dangerous criminals easily walking the streets, even after just a year in jail or something, after they've murdered somebody. I think we need to deal with that. I also say that there are times when, even in jail, certain criminals are so dangerous that they cause the death of other prisoners. And so there can be, I think, exceptions. And I would say one has to, I think, prove to be demonstrably a danger to others. And we have to deal with that accordingly, ideally with something short of the death penalty. But I do understand why some people are pretty passionate about it. And I'm personally against its use, but I think that I understand why some people would say, no, I think we need to make more use of it. It'll have a deterrent effect and all these other things. But, enough said.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Are you going to get into trouble with me, Father, on this? Are you going to opine?
no, I hold the same opinion
I
as you
never
do.
come away from a death penalty discussion without being in trouble with somebody.
Well, no, I agree with you. I think that I agree with John Paul II, and Pope Benedict said the same thing. I even think, and of course, Pope Francis did, is that I don't think we need it to have
No,
recourse today, but I don't think it's right to call it intrinsically evil,
yeah,
because
right.
it's just not stated biblically as being such. And
Yeah.
I think there might be places somewhere not in the
Mhm.
United States where it's necessary.
Yeah,
I don't know.
exactly right.
I
Yeah.
don't know. So that's something where it's there, but I think the whole point of the fifth commandment is all life is precious,
Hmm.
and we need to safeguard life from from the point of conception till natural death, and that's probably the best way of approaching life
Yeah,
until the soul dies naturally and meets their maker.
that's right. Amen. Amen.
So
Trust God, trust God.
hey,
He's the author of all life and the sustainer.
all right, folks. So we are halfway done the commandments, and we will hit number 6 next week, and
Mhm.
uh, and then it's downhill from there. So, all right. Can we get a
You're
blessing?
lying to me. Wait, yeah, but Father, maybe as I do the blessing of the prayer, I'd like to read just one little part of the end of this catechetical treatise. It's from the Catechism 2269, and it's something for all of us to think about. So the fifth commandment also forbids doing anything with the intention of indirectly bringing about a person's death. The moral law prohibits exposing someone to mortal danger without a grave reason, as well as refusing assistance to a person in grave danger, and so on. So we want to act in ways that are reverential of human life, not act recklessly, violently, or in dangerous fashion by, horrifying driving and speeding and having car races and all the kind of stuff that sometimes you hear about. So let's take good care of each other. Let's remember our lives are sacred because they come from God and are called back to God one day. So may Almighty God bless you all, the Father, the Son, and the Holy
Holy
Spirit.
Spirit. Amen.
Amen.